actually, the recording is going to be from this point on because I did not hit recording for the first 10-15 minutes of the recording, unfortunately. So the actual requirements of the rubric, but the questions are recorded. I'm sorry, I had it all ready to hit record and then I didn't. But you'll be able to get a copy, get a recording of the questions that are being asked. So Angel's question about Starbucks, and how Starbucks is changing its offerings to be more competitive with its competition. The passage of time that Laura asked, the passage of time can just be proved by observing the demand trends. When there's a change in price, you will be able to observe the changes in demand, and if they're a little delayed, you can go read the notes to the financial statements and see what it says. The financial statements, the notes to the financial statements are a real source and rich source of information, and I do absolutely recommend you to read them. It might be a little boring, but you want to read them because they will also help you in Milestone 3 when you're trying to provide recommendations for the firm. So at the end of Milestone 3, you have to provide recommendations. And when you read the notes, you'll be able to find information regarding what the company wants to do in the future, and this will allow you to also provide recommendations that are original, not something that's already being planned by the company, because you might have new ideas. Because remember, you're acting as a consultant for the firm, and so you're doing this economic research so that you can eventually provide guidance to the firm on how to improve in the future. Laura has one more. I have read all the chapters and taken all the tests, but for some reason I struggle with elasticity, so I fear writing about it. Any suggestions? The only thing I can do is I can provide you with a link to some YouTube videos that I really like, that I use, that of this this teacher who makes really great videos. This is an ad for a project about price elasticity and everything else, really. Here's the link that I use. Oh, thank you, Todd, for the previous economics recordings. Yes, every once in a while I forget to hit the record button. It's happened before. I'm glad actually someone mentioned it, so I went to start it, and at least macroeconomics will have a full recording. This YouTube video I've shared is MJM Foodie, and if you go on it, she has all the microeconomics videos, and go look at the price elasticity and see how she explains it, and then definitely go on the Khan Academy and see how they explain price elasticity. Sometimes if you see it on a whiteboard explained and drawn out, it makes more sense than just reading it off the book and trying to interpret the graphs. And Laura, if you still have problems with price elasticity, I really encourage you to reach out to your instructor for additional resources or additional explanation on how price elasticity works. Basically, just to say it in a few words here, price elasticity is the reactiveness of the consumer to a change in price. So if the price of a good increases by $1 and consumption decreases by one customer, you can say that the good is price elastic. That means that if there is a change in price, there will be a change in the quantity demanded. The price elasticity can be, if you're looking at the demand curve of a product, it can be assumed by the inclination of the curve, how the slopes, because if it slopes, the more it slopes, so if you get a vertical demand curve, that's a price inelastic curve. That means that at any price, there's never going to be a change in the quantity demanded. And, because it's just a vertical curve. So, yes, there are several recordings. If you go on the SNU Connect, SNU Echo YouTube page. Every semester we record webinars for Milestone 1, Milestone 2, and Milestone 3. I started recording them in May. If you go before May, you'll find Nicole's recordings. If you go after May, they're the recordings I made. And you know, you can look at the old recordings because the questions asked by the students are different. You know, different things come out from different recordings sometimes. Yes, Nikki, I know price elasticity of demand can be challenging. But if you look at the determinants of price elasticity of demand and you learn them, it really helps you understand price elasticity of demand. The other thing I recommend students is to use the resources available in the My Econ Lab. So if you go in My Econ Lab and you click on it and then you scroll down to the bottom, it says My Econ Lab Multimedia Library. You click on the multimedia library and you just go find price elasticity, and there's videos, there's PowerPoints that sum up what the textbook does, and sometimes there's even articles in the news. And if you go look at those, you might sometimes the PowerPoints help because they focus on the main thing rather than the textbook that talks. The PowerPoints are summaries, they're bullet points, and they can be very helpful to you know, frame a topic. So oh yes, Laura, you could, your neighbors, you could get together and study together. But Laura, really reach out if you have difficulty. Reach out. There's also resources offered by SNU. There's tutoring offered by SNU, and the tutoring helps you transfer the knowledge you got from the textbook and put it into your milestone. That's what they help you do. So you can even ask your advisor to put you in contact with a tutor through SNU and do that. And since you're in Florida, you would have a tutor that, you know, works remotely, obviously. But they can guide you on how to convert the theory into your milestone, basically. If, you know, the resources that you've reached out for are not enough for you to get a good understanding of price elasticity of demand. Are there any more questions? We have 1 more minute to answer the question. And otherwise, we'll get ready to switch over to macroeconomics. I see someone is typing, so I'll wait a second. Oh, thank you. You're welcome, Irene. Good night. I'll start getting ready the macroeconomics screen. Oh, Michael, thank you. Good night. Good night, Nikki, Laura, Marlene, Angel. You're so welcome. Okie dokie, that's not what I wanted to select. Let's see if I can find the actual, there we go. So it's 9 o'clock. If you're logging in now, we're getting ready to go over the macroeconomics Milestone 2, Echo 202. My name is Kiara Yates, and I'm sitting in, I know it shows Nicole Soto, but she created the account to run the webinars, and they just never changed it. I'm Kiara Yates. I'm an economics instructor for SNU. I've been working with SNU since 2012, and I teach both macro and microeconomics, mostly macroeconomics. And this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to access it either through the link provided by your instructor, or you would be able to find it on the SNU Eco channel on YouTube. If you go on the SNU Eco channel, you will be able to look at the recording of all the webinars that have been run live for the past couple of years. Nicole Soto ran them up until before the summer, and I've taken over since the summer. So hello, everybody. I'm glad to have you here. Let's get to work on Milestone 2. So in Milestone 1, you did some research. You had to research the data related to your decade. The decade you chose during Module 1, during the discussion question of Module 1. And then during Milestone 1, you researched the GDP, you researched unemployment and inflation, and you researched interest rates. You will need this data through Milestone 2 and Milestone 3 to find out how the fiscal policies in Milestone 2 and the monetary policies in Milestone 3 impacted the economy during your decade. The first slide of the fiscal policies milestone is looking back before your decade. So if you're doing the 2000s, why did the year 2000 start with a recession? Basically, it started with a recession because there was the technology bubble at the end of the decade, and you might want to also look into what fiscal policies were enacted towards the end of the decade that might have impacted the beginning of the 2000s. So when you're looking at the first slide, if you're doing the 90s, you want to look at policies from the 80s. The 80s, you're looking at the 70s. The 70s, you're looking at the 60s, and so forth. You're not looking at the policies enacted the first year of your decade, but you're looking at the policies enacted a few years before your decade started. I've had students who've even gone back 10 years before the decade started because there are policies that might have carried a long-term effect and that might have affected, say, the beginning of the 80s and the hyperinflation. I mean, that can be tracked back to the policies of the 60s, and some students did it, and that's perfectly fine. But you don't have to go that far back. All you need to do is go as far back as you think is enough and sufficient to identify fiscal policies that impacted the beginning of your decade. When you look at this slide, you have actually this final project slide in your course resources, in the final project resources of your course. You go on it because all these blue links that you can see here, like the Congressional Budget Office, White House website, National Bureau, they're all links to websites or videos that you can watch to help you develop your PowerPoint. So what you want to do is basically look at what happened in the years that led up to the start of your decade. What caused your decade to start the way it did? As I said, the 2000s started with a recession, the 90s started with a recession, the 80s started with very high levels of inflation and unemployment, and so you want to go back and find out why those decades started in that economic condition, and you want to explain what the economic situation at the beginning of your decade was. So you're going to frame your oh, Karen, are you having trouble hearing me? Is anybody else having trouble hearing me before we move on? Okay, so Karen, I think it might be your connection or your computer that is breaking it up. Okay, I'm glad you can all hear me well. Well, Karen, there's going to be a recording of this webinar available tomorrow morning on YouTube. So if you follow us, because there's going to be questions at the end and most of the questions are written, but then you can go and watch it again to make sure that you didn't miss any important parts. Now, the other really important requirements for the milestone is that you develop the content in the speaker notes. And I don't know if any of you has had trouble with that during Milestone 1. I for sure have had some students who have not developed the speaker notes. They only develop the slides. If you only develop the slides, you will only get a needs improvement for that specific element of the rubric. It doesn't matter how much content you put in it and how well you wrote it, and if you wrote 10 slides about it, if you didn't develop the content in the speaker notes, the rubric does not allow us to give you a proficient for that element. Once you've framed your decade and you've explained why your decade started in a certain economic situation, you can go on and you can focus on your decade. So the policies of your decade. Now make sure you focus on the whole decade. You don't just focus, say, on the beginning of the decade and then forget the end of it. Okay? Because the whole decade is relevant. Now, if there's a policy enacted in 1989, you obviously won't be, I mean, you can still establish the impact, but the impact will be back in the 90s, obviously. That is fine. But you want to make sure that you identify the policies of your decade, the most relevant one. There's going to be some decades that have tons of fiscal policies. You don't have to list every single policy year by year, even if they're small little things that didn't do anything. You want to find the most relevant policies for your decade, and you want to explain what the intent. Now, there's a difference between what the impact of the policy is and what the intent of the policy was. So if the intent of the policy was, for example, to reduce unemployment, that is what you will write in this slide, is the intent. Why did the government pass this policy? What were they looking to do? And that is all you want to do. You don't want to write what happened thanks to the policy, but just what they thought was going to happen if they passed that policies. And you also can use macroeconomic principle and models to explain the intent of the policy and what some policies may do. In this regards, you might want to go look specifically at Chapter 16. Chapter 16 explains perfectly well the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, and how an expansionary fiscal policy or a contractionary fiscal policy would affect the economy in terms of aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So you can go on Chapter 16 of your textbook and you can read it and you can look at the graphs and you can use that model in this milestone to show what impact the fiscal policies were supposed to have. And then you can use the model to see if the fiscal policies, the impact of the fiscal policies were consistent with the model, and sometimes they're not consistent with the model. Because, the economy is a lot more random than the models they've created. The models have been created on observations from the past, but a lot of factors change. Once you have, again here, develop the content in the speaker notes and just use the slides for the main, more relevant concepts. For example, in the fiscal policy actions, you would just use the slide maybe to name the fiscal policies, the year they were enacted, and then in the speaker notes, you can explain the intent of the policies. On the last slide, you're going to explain the impact of the policy. To explain the impact of the policy, this is where you can use all the research you did in Milestone 1. Go look at what happened to growth after the policy was enacted, what happened to unemployment, what happened to inflation, and you can see, did they go up, did they go down, did they stay stable? And that is how you can explain the impact of your policy. At the same time, you also want to explain how the policies impacted individual households and businesses. That is very important. You need this element too to be at least proficient in your milestone. So if there was a policy, for example, that brought reduced taxes for middle class, then you know that increased the available income for the middle class. So how did that affect households? They had more disposable income. They could spend more. They could save more. So you want to explain that. You want to find that out. And that is how you're going to develop the fiscal policy impact. Here again, you can use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model if you want to demonstrate if the policy was effective. Did the policy achieve what it was intended for? So if it was intended to reduce unemployment, did it work? Did it not work? This is your opportunity to see if the policy was successful. It might have been more successful than they intended it to be, might have been less successful. It might have done exactly what it was intended to do. Again, you will use the slide to show key concepts, and then you will develop the content in the speaker notes. In the speaker notes, you provide your explanation, and you just what your findings are. Use the slides to put in visual aids. If you're going to use an aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, for example, you would include it in the slide, and then you would explain it in the speaker notes. I just want to recommend you something that has come up from student questions from other classes. It's often easy to confuse what you think about a decade and what you know about a decade because you read about it or you researched it. Sometimes we start research of these decades not knowing anything about it. Some of you chose your decade because you were curious about the 60s because you were born later. You were born in the 70s, you were born in the 80s, and you know nothing about previous decades. And so you chose older decades because you wanted to learn about it. Others, you chose the 2000s because you've lived through the 2000s and you know about it. But you need to be careful because what you know about it without having any economic knowledge may affect the outcome of your presentation, because you might be including more of what you think you know about it or your opinion is about it, and not enough facts about your decade. Make sure you research it. Try to set aside your opinion and be objective when you do your research and when you develop your fiscal policy and your monetary policy slides, especially if you're doing the 2000s, because that's the decade everybody remembers, and we're still sort of not recovering from it, but you know, it's a fresh memory. So you really want to make sure that you base your findings on your research. You will have an opportunity to provide your opinion about the decade at the end when you submit your final project. There's a conclusion slide that you will have to develop, in which you need to express whether you agree or you disagree with the policies enacted during the decade, you know, with the decisions made by the government. And when you provide your opinion, again, you will be asked to substantiate it with sources, with any information of economic relevance that can support your opinion. It doesn't matter if it's a controversial opinion. That is not what, you know, we're looking for. You can be as opinionated as you want, as long as you can support your opinion. But that is the place where you will be doing it, is in the conclusion slide, is where you will be using your opinion regarding your decade. In the Milestone 2 and in Milestone 3, you're not using your opinion. You're using what you have researched, the knowledge and the information you have found by researching the Federal Reserve website. You can research the White House website. You can find the policies enacted by each president to build up your decade. There's the History Encyclopedia website that is a good source to find. And once you find the names of the policies and you have identified what policies are more relevant for your decade, then you'll be able to do additional research. You can go on the Shapiro Library and research the policies on there and find papers on NBER or other economic publication websites that will give you a good academic paper. The other important thing about Milestone 2 to remember is that you want to back up you want to cite scholarly sources. And this is written in the slides too. Scholarly research is required. To be exemplary in the final, you will have to have scholarly research to support your slides. That is the only way you're going to be exemplary, because that is the additional requirement to be exemplary in the final. So just make sure that you cite your sources, because you might have the scholarly research, but if you don't cite it, we don't know that you used it for these slides. So you want to make sure you cite correctly. Every element of your reference list needs to correspond to a citation in your presentation. Mary, how about many fiscal policies should we reference in this milestone? I'm doing the 70s. Exactly, Mary, there are a lot sometimes. So I would identify the most important ones, the ones that had a greater impact on the decade, because it would take you forever if you wanted to identify every single fiscal policy. I would say, I mean, if I have to say a number, I would say if you can find 3 fiscal policies that are relevant, that is good. Now, for the 70s. Now, if you're studying the 50s, you might have difficulty getting 3 fiscal policies. One or, 2 fiscal policies are probably appropriate. You may use the graphs from the textbook if they're relevant to your to what the content of your slides. You just to make sure that you reference them and you cite them, Karen. So you need to show that you got that graph somewhere, the chart somewhere, that you didn't make it up yourself. And if you want to use the charts from the textbook, I recommend that you go in my econ lab in the multimedia library, because there's the PowerPoints. Those PowerPoints contain all the charts from the book because they use the charts to build the PowerPoints, and you probably be able to copy them more easily. So you are at a loss on how to find the actual fiscal policy. I'm not understanding how to navigate the White House website. Well, there are depending on which presidents went through your decade, you would find the name of the president. If you can't find it through the White House website, you can just Google White House and the name of the president, and it'll probably take you to the correct page of the White House website. And usually they list the main accomplishments of that president. And so the fiscal policy that they would list would be the most prominent ones, not all of them, the most important ones. For example, for Clinton in the 90s, it would list most likely the budget acts that he passed to reduce the budget deficit. Yes, M, you said you could use some data from Milestone 1. If we do that, how should we handle citing it? For instance, we're referencing graphs we made on Fred and put them in Milestone 1. Well, what you can do is when you're explaining, for example, that thanks to increased government spending, there's been an increase in growth. Okay, let's assume a generic without mentioning any decades. You can refer to the graph, say, as my findings from slide 1, for example, or you can put another copy. You can get the same chart you used in slide 1 and bring it down, or you can just use the numbers. Because once you have the chart, you have the numbers. Like for the growth chart, there was a 2% growth, for example. You can mention that 2% growth, and you can just cite the same source that you cited the first time you used it in Milestone 1. Adara, yes, you're doing the 70s. The 70s, you can find in the White House website. Another good source is is the Federal Reserve History website. Even though it's the Federal Reserve, if you go on the 70s, while it's talking about monetary policies, it actually talks a lot about fiscal policies also, because sometimes they work hand in hand and they'll be mentioned. I know you're not supposed to use Wikipedia as an academic source. It is not recommended. Your instructor will highlight it if you do use it. However, Dara, for example, in your case, you can use it as a starting point to find the list, or what fiscal policies were enacted in the 1970s. And once you have those names, then you can go research them somewhere else. But once you have found out what policies were enacted in the 1970s, then you can go find a credible website, a credible source. Like you can go on the Shapiro Library through SNU, and you can just write the name of the policy and maybe the year it was enacted, and then you can get a good scholarly source through the Shapiro Library, for example. Are we going to include Milestone 1 slide with Milestone 2? Tammy and Karen have the same question. This really depends on your instructor. I don't have a preference in my classes, and I tell the students they can either continue, because then when you continue, you sort of have your final project already built, or you can submit it as a separate submission. Some instructors do have a preference, and so you should really ask your instructor if they maybe read through their announcement. They might have written it somewhere, or you can ask them again, and they will let you know. Just because, Karen, should this milestone be appended to what we submitted? Yeah, I mean, it really depends. Some instructors prefer them to be separate because when we do the originality report, then we have the originality report just for that milestone, and we don't have to go look if, the originality is affected by milestone one. But I mean, as I said, most instructors probably don't care either way, how you, if you put them together or you don't, and definitely it would not affect your grade. If you decide to continue under milestone one and continue with the slides, it's not going to affect your grade. You might get a note from your instructor asking you to keep it separate for milestone three at the most. Michael is asking, fiscal policy action slide is for policy during our decade. That is correct. So the second slide is for the policies during your decade. Well, the first slide, which is just fiscal policies on this presentation, is the policies from before your decade that affected your decade, basically. So the first slide, you have to go in the past and frame your decade. And then in the second slide, you're actually researching only your decade. And you're researching the whole decade, Michael. You're not, like some decades have more prominent fiscal policies at the beginning, some more at the end. You have to research the whole decade, find, because for example, the 60s, you have the war on poverty towards the end of the decade, but what happened at the beginning of the decade? In the 50s, you have the Highway Act at the end of the decade. But what happened at the beginning of the decade, there was the war in Korea, for example. So the war in Korea is a form of fiscal policy that involves heavy government spending, and that can be used to see what impacted the beginning of the decade. So make sure you cover the whole decade. You don't just cover the first part or just the second part. Oh, you're welcome, Michael. You really want to make sure that, and when you also examine the impact, you want to go throughout the decade. If your decade is all the 70s, you want to do all the 70s, not just up to, 75, because what happened in the last 5 years of the decade? You just want to make sure you do it all, because I've noticed that this sometimes is an issue when in some of my classes that they forget, there's some important policies during some decades that make you forget that there's other years to complete the decade. Is it better to avoid policies enacted at the end of your decade? Not necessarily, Karen. If it's a really important policy, you can include it. But not just include that, because you're also, you need to look at the whole decade. That's what I mean. If you can do the end of the decade, but you need to do the beginning of the decade too. You can't just focus on the end of the decade because that was the most important policy. If you do the end of the decade, obviously the impact of a policy enacted in 1959 is going to fall into the 60s, because it takes a while for the effects of the policies to take place. Tammy, is the National Bureau of Economic and Fred White House website considered scholarly sources? Yes, Tammy, those are good sources. The National Bureau of Economic and Fred are excellent. The White House website is a very good source to use. Any suggestions on using the NBER? Chris, honestly, I usually use Google and just change the words in it. When it comes to NBER, I've noticed that the initial explanation of, I don't necessarily have to open the file and read the whole paper, because the summary they make of the paper seems to be sufficient to give you a pretty good view of the policies for the decade. And then when you have that initial step in, you're able to find additional information through other websites. Often that you will find, once you know what you're looking for, you have the name of a policy, or you have the information for the decade, you will find a lot of newspaper articles that go back to the decade. I found information on the decades on the New York Times, on the Washington Post, on Forbes, because they make parallels sometimes with the current decade. And so you find really useful information, and they might sometimes include a chart that you can use in your research. Sometimes they go through the impact of the policies, and if you find it in a newspaper article, the impact, just double check it to make sure that it's not politically biased, because some publications, like newspapers and magazines, are. So you might want to have more than one source to verify that they determine the impact in a more unbiased way. And if it's biased, then you can have two sources to balance each other out, for example. But with Ember, Chris, would probably work also best if you use it through the Shapiro library, just because you can specify which source you want to use. Say you want to use the National Bureau of Economics, and then you can put the topic, and then it will find you only the articles that talk about the 70s, for example, in Ember. So you can use that. Again, as I said, when you want to look at you want to use the models, go to chapter 16 of your textbook and go to chapter 16 resources in the My Econ Lab, the multimedia library, because then you'll find there's videos, you find the PowerPoints, and the PowerPoints are really, I find them invaluable, because they're very well summarized in explaining if there's an expansionary fiscal policy, this is what happens, and it'll show you graphically what happens to the model. So they're really useful. The other chapter that goes over the model is chapter 13, and it's a general explanation of the model. But chapter 16 focuses on the impact of the fiscal policies on the model. And this way you can use it in your presentation to integrate the theory with what you found, about your decade, what you found out. It's very, very useful. Does anybody have any more questions? We have a few minutes left before we close the webinar. So if you have a question, this would be a good time to ask. Just fiscal policy then for this? Yes, Karen, this milestone focuses only on fiscal policies. When you research the fiscal policies, very important, don't confuse them with the monetary policies, and don't confuse them with policies that are just government policies but are not fiscal policies. Specifically, a fiscal policy is a policy directed to change government spending and taxation. This is what a fiscal policy is. If there's a policy that is enacted to change bank regulations, that is not a monetary policy, and that is not a fiscal policy. So, policies, for example, that want to increase Wall Street regulation or banking regulations, like some of the policies that they had to enact during the recession, those are not fiscal policies. They're not even monetary policies, because they're just regulations. They increase the rules that banks and Wall Street and other organizations have to follow. Do we need to put a graph on any of our slides? Jen, in this case, you really don't need a graph. You might find useful to use a graph when you're explaining the fiscal policy impact. And yes, Fred would be always the source to use. And you can also reuse parts of the slides or the information that you used in Milestone 1. So you can maybe make a table, or you can use the same graph. You can refer to the graph from Milestone 1 and just maybe identify some numbers from it, like the percentage growth or the percentage not growth in case of a recession. Yes, the RRA is a fiscal policy. That is like the prime example of what a fiscal policy is, Karen. Tammy, you're welcome, Tammy. No, trading policies do not apply to this milestone. Reserve the trading policies for the 2 slides you will be developing in the final, where you will be doing 2 slides on foreign trade. So NAFTA has a minor component of fiscal policy. If you go read through it, there was some government spending involved, and some instructor will let it slide. Will accept NAFTA as a fiscal policy that impacted the economy during the 90s, but it's a little bit on the wider range. NAFTA is definitely part of the foreign trade. I mean, that is where it would be more relevant, and you would become a little repetitive if you can just talk about it in the fiscal policies because it was a really important policy, but maybe not stress it a lot. Focus on the other policies. Since the 90s had the budget policies that are the OBRAs, which are really, really important. In the late 90s, there was a change in taxation. You have plenty of fiscal policies in the 90s to discuss so that you don't have to use NAFTA in the fiscal policy milestone. Oh, you're welcome, Karen. Amtrak Improvement Act not be a policy. The Amtrak Improvement Act would be a policy. It is a fiscal policy because they spent $330 million to improve the train system. So they improved transportation throughout the country, and they gave jobs. It created jobs for people because they had to spend the money. So Chris, yes, that is a good example of a fiscal policy, the Amtrak Improvement Act. Just like the Highway Act at the end of the 50s, that is a really good fiscal policies. And when you describe the impact of those policies, you're not just describing the impact in terms of increasing employment opportunities, but you're also describing impact of how it might have changed the life. Because if you have more trains to travel around, people are going to move more. And so there's a change in lifestyle. So you can also identify that as an impact of a fiscal policy. Yeah, it's good to ask. If you guys are not sure, before you include them in your milestone, write an email to your instructor and ask them, hey, are these valid fiscal policies for my decade? And yes, no, maybe your instructor will guide you. And this way you just want to be sure. That's what we're here for. We're here to answer any questions that you have. We're here to provide additional resources if you're having trouble going through. I often help my students with finding sources to research their decade because sometimes they're struggling, and I'm just happy to put them in the right, put them in the right direction so that they can find it. I give them a head start, 1 or 2 sources that they can use, and then find additional ones on their own. That's what we're here for. Reach out to your instructors because, they'll help you. They want to see you succeed just as much as, they want to see you successful, end the course successfully. They want to see you learn and enjoy the course. You're welcome, Chris. If there's no more questions, I will close this session, and I hope to see you back at Milestone 3. And you're welcome, Mary. And you're welcome, Em. And as I said, email your instructors, ask questions in the general questions of your classroom if you don't want to email privately, because your colleagues, the other students might benefit from the answer that you get. So that is also a good venue to go ask. Talisha, you're welcome. I'm glad it was useful, and I hope to see you back at Milestone 3. Where we're going through the monetary policies. That's really nice. Milestone 3 is